Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the Institute for Australian and Chinese Arts and Culture at Western Sydney University. I'm Professor Jing Han, director of this institute. The music you just heard was composed by our research fellow and musician, Dr. Nicholas Ng. Before we start, I would like to acknowledge that our institute is on Parramatta South Campus, which is on the country of the Darug people of the Darug Nation, and acknowledge their ancestors who have been the traditional owners of their country for thousands of years. We also want to pay our respect to the First Nations elders of the countries we are all sitting on today, past, present, and emerging. IEC Online Chinese Australian History Series 3 started with the talk around the book of oral history by Mavis Gok Yan, Guo Meihua, South Flows the Pearl, presented by the book's editors Xiaomei Yan, Yan Xiaomei, and Richard Horsberg. You can still access the recording of the session 1, which is on our website, along with the recordings of the last 2 series. For lecture 2, we are delighted and thrilled and honored to have Dr. Alina Camp to talk about Chinese women as a cultural custodians in white Australia, a very interesting topic. After my brief introduction of Dr. Alina Camp, Alina will give a presentation, followed by my conversation with Alina. We will then take some questions from the audiences. So please post your questions in the Q&A function at the bottom of the screen, and I will collect them for Alina to respond. Dr. Alina Camp is a researcher and a lecturer in Geography and Urban Studies, School of Social Sciences at Western Sydney University. She is also a research fellow in the Young and Resilient Research Centre at Western Sydney University and a member of the Challenging Racist Project and Centre of Resilient and Inclusive Societies. She is very much a rising star, very shining. Dr. Camp has published pioneering and award-winning work on Chinese Australian women's experiences of a national and cultural identity, racism, and belonging. Her latest book, Intersectional Lives, Chinese Australian Women in White Australia, was published by Routledge, London in April 2022. I'm very happy to report that I've read the report and I couldn't recommend, I read the book and I couldn't recommend it higher. It is immensely interesting, informative, enlightening, and engaging book. It is a perfect example of combining scholarly rigor with the great storytelling skills. It is such an enjoyable reading. We will talk more about the book. Now, please welcome Dr. Alina Camp to give her presentation.
Thank you. I'll just share my screen with everyone now. Okay, fantastic. So thank you, Professor Han, for that beautiful introduction. Very special and a bit overwhelmed by your kind words. And thank you everyone for Zooming in today. It's a great honour to be part of this history series. Before I begin, I'd like to acknowledge the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation as the traditional custodians of the country that I have the privilege and honour to speak to you from today. I recognise the Gadigal people's continued connection and care of the land, sky and waterways that nourish this country. I pay my respects to elders past and present and extend that respect to all Aboriginal elders that are here with us today. I would also like to acknowledge peoples of the Darug, Darawal and Wiradjuri nations, as it's on their unceded lands that I live and work, and on which the research I present today and the book that it's from was researched and written. So as Professor Han said, today I'll be presenting a very small portion of the research I conducted quite a while ago for the book Intersectional Lives, which I only launched 2 weeks ago. So quite fresh off the press, but has been in my life for over a decade now. The central premise of my book is to stridently make visible the lives and intersectional experiences of females of Chinese ancestry during the White Australia policy era. Many, if not most of our history books claim that there were either no Chinese women here in Australia during that time. The White Australia Policy era spanned from Federation in 1901 until the Whitlam Labor government formally abolished it in 1973. Or these history books claimed that if there were Chinese women here, there wasn't enough of them to warrant any research about them. Or the third alternative is that their lives have simply been ignored and overlooked. My research found that in fact, thousands of women of Chinese ancestry were in Australia between 1901 and 1973. I delved into the census records to prove that. And I believe that the presence of a relatively small number of women doesn't warrant exclusion from research. Small numbers of any groups of women, any groups of people doesn't exclude them, shouldn't exclude them from research. And if we are to have a more complete understanding of Australia's social, economic and political development, as well as Chinese Australian history and broader understandings of the Chinese diaspora, these women's lives need to be acknowledged. So I wanted to use my position as an academic to provide a space or platform in which these women's lives could be brought out of the shadows, and some of them, albeit only a very small proportion, could have their lives told in their own voices. Remembering that the White Australia Policy was formally abolished only in 1973, we are so lucky to still have these women with us to share their stories, and I had the privilege to speak to some of them. So who were or who are these women? Sorry, my screen's just frozen. I interviewed 19 women for this book, and some of their images are appearing up on the screen now. These women have had such a diversity of family histories in Australia and diversity of experiences. Their lives help us conceptualise Chinese women in the diaspora as gendered, classed, culturally varied and racialised individuals with multiple identities, multiple subjectivities and different forms of agency and mobility. They are not a homogenous group of oppressed women relegated to the home and domestic servitude, as narrow conceptions of Confucian ideology would have us believe. As I'm sure you can imagine, through my research, I was able to gain a huge amount of information about the lives of these women, but because of the limited time I have with you today, I'll just be focusing on their contributions and the contributions of their mothers and their grandmothers to maintaining culture and identity within homes and family life. To give you a little bit of background about the 19 women I interviewed, 13 of them were born in Australia and had great-grandparents who had migrated to Australia from the 1800s, and 6 of the women were migrants to Australia. For those who were born in Australia, they were born across the continent from as far north as Thursday Island, which is off the tip of Queensland, across rural Queensland and rural New South Wales, and of course in metropolitan cities like Sydney and Melbourne. At the time that I interviewed them, they ranged from around age 57 and into their 80s. So their memories dated as far back as the 1920s. And they often spoke about their mothers and grandmothers who had, of course, been here even earlier than that. So quite a vast history of Chinese Australian women's lives. So talking about women, Chinese Australian women as keepers of culture. As many of you know, I feel like I'm speaking to people who are already well versed in this. Traditional Chinese culture, based on Confucian ideology, is patriarchal, with males and females taking on very different roles and responsibilities within the family. As with most patriarchal family systems, Confucian ideology prescribes women to the domestic realm, being responsible for the household chores, cooking and cleaning, bearing and nurturing children who will then continue the patrilineal family line. The research I conducted revealed that these Confucian ideals were maintained in varied and diverse ways in the white Australia context. But what became strikingly evident was a relationship between women's roles in the home and that maintenance of culture. For example, it was through mothers' household and family duties that specific practices relating to food, language, and etiquette were inadvertently maintained and passed down to their children, simply in the routine realities of their everyday life at home. By maintaining cultural practices such as language, food habits, and more formal organised festivities, such as Chinese New Year, women were central to passing down cultural knowledge to their children. While in many instances, women were pretty purposeful and cognizant in this maintenance of culture, often, particularly amongst migrant mothers, it was an inadvertent passing down of language and food culture, simply as a consequence of their caring and nurturing roles in the family and their limited knowledge of English or more Western cooking styles. And I'll talk about this more in a moment. So in this way, mothers did not pass down cultural knowledge due to rigid perceptions that they were bearers of tradition, keepers of culture, or embodiments of Chinese identity. Rather, Chinese Australian women's maintenance of cultural practices were just part and parcel of being a Chinese wife and mother. I do want to flag at this point that while this presentation will highlight that many mothers were maintaining Chinese culture, not all mothers took on this role, and there was a diversity of experience. My book really is about the diversity of experiences. In some families, it was fathers who were more outspoken in maintaining Chinese culture and identity. And in some families, the traditions and practices were completely abandoned for more Australian ways of life. And before I get into the nitty-gritty of what the women were doing in their homes and families, I want to point to a context of cultural isolation at this time in history. With restricted immigration, participants and their families were often the only Chinese in their street, in their neighbourhood and in their schools. Close friends and extended family were often located in distant towns or cities across Australia, or in fact remained in China and Hong Kong. This sense of isolation is explicit in the words of one of the women I spoke to, Mi Lin, who's featured here on the far left of the party. As she grew up in the town of Ballina in rural New South Wales, she said, "We were so isolated from other Chinese families. The closest would have been 40 miles away, and we had cousins 60 miles away." These recollections of being one of very few Chinese Australians in neighbourhoods and communities hint at what I term double isolation. So these women were not only culturally isolated because of policies of assimilation and discrimination, but they were also physically removed and distanced from others in similar circumstances. So in this way, the opportunity to maintain culture, language, traditions, celebrations within a social context was really limited. And so in that way, the home provided a really important space in which culture could be practiced and maintained. So let's go down to everyone's favourite topic, Chinese food. With very limited opportunities to eat Chinese food in restaurants or cafes, particularly for people who were living in rural areas or in the suburbs, homes were the central site in which Chinese cuisine could be maintained. And usually it was by mothers who fulfilled their role of feeding the family. So for example, it was mothers who cooked daily meals, making the most of what limited produce they could obtain to provide simple meals of rice and vegetables and fish. Or as Sally says here, you can see little Sally here on the far right, the little girl in the front, said that her mum would make more elaborate meals of plain rice and a dish of steak and Chinese vegetables. Rather than viewing this role of feeding the family through a patriarchal lens of oppression, I think we can view this as a really powerful position, that Chinese Australian women were able to maintain cultural practices in the form of food traditions and therefore their identity, despite broader context of white Australia, which urged and often forced them to assimilate. Another example, and this is one of my favourite photographs, this is one of my interview participants, Eileen's mother, at her noodle shop in Cairns. And Eileen remembered her mum being extremely resourceful, preparing hamie, or saltfish, a traditional Chinese ingredient that couldn't be found in Aussie shops or markets. And she said, Mum would make saltfish. The house was built up on large posts, a Queenslander. Mum would have these saltfish hanging from the beams, and kids would come and say, "What's that, gee, it smells." So these research findings also suggest that mothers pass down cooking skills to a younger generation and were therefore central to the continuation and passing down of food culture and knowledge. Susan, another interview participant, remembered that her mother taught her Chinese cooking skills, and she said, "Mum taught us how to do dim sum, and we watched her as she did her cooking." Unfortunately, Susan no longer cooks Chinese meals, but other participants, such as Mei Lin, who's here with her brother on the screen, certainly do. So Mei Lin, for example, actually hated the fact that she had to eat Chinese food when she was growing up, and she just wanted to be like everyone else. She said, "Why do we have to be Chinese? Why do we have to eat all this rice? Why can't we just have steak and eggs?" And when I asked her if she cooks Chinese food now, interestingly, she said, "Yes, I do. I must say, when I've been overseas on a holiday, the first thing I do is come home, buy a roast duck and cook some rice." So as an adult, food provides Mei Lin with a sense of comfort and familiarity. Nancy, who's now on the screen, similarly cooks Chinese food now as a mother, and has passed her food culture on to her children. She says, "I cook a lot of Chinese food, and it's one legacy I like to think I'm leaving to my children." Nancy can't speak Chinese, and so it's her ability to cook Chinese food that plays an important link to her heritage. And by describing her food culture as a legacy, I think she's highlighting the important role of food in multi-generational cultural knowledge, awareness, and maintenance. And in my mind, it suggests that she's also adopted the role of cultural custodian in her adult life. Eileen, the lady now up on the screen, similarly reiterated this notion of food as a cultural legacy and her own role as a cultural custodian. And you can see that in her quotes on the screen. She told me very proudly that she can cook everything from Chinese food to Italian food to Lebanese food, but it's the Chinese cooking that has a particular role in her family. And it's important to note that while Eileen's children have the opportunity to eat Chinese food in context beyond in the home now, unlike the previous generation, they still ask Eileen to cook them those meals. So she's central to her family's maintenance of culture and passing down of that knowledge. I want to move now to language. So language is usually the first trait that disappears in processes of migration and settlement, particularly when assimilation, like in the White Australia policy era, is encouraged. However, Chinese language newspapers are tangible evidence that Cantonese dialects did not disappear from Chinese Australian communities during the White Australia era. For example, in the early 1920s, up to 5 Chinese language newspapers were in circulation. But beyond these public or outward-looking demonstrations of Chinese language in Australia, little is known of the ways in which language was practiced within the private and intimate spheres of home and family life during the White Australia context, or more specifically, women's experiences of Chinese language. The women I interviewed recalled that the maintenance of Chinese language in their childhood homes were not usually a result of enforced learning or use of Chinese language by parents, but more of an incidental consequence, particularly of their mother's own language skills. Despite policies of assimilation, migrant mothers were often unable to speak English, with their responsibilities centred on the running of the household and the care of children, or out the back of family businesses. Once in Australia, opportunities to learn English were very limited, and it was generally not necessary for their everyday interactions. The inability of migrant mothers to speak English was also partly, for some of the women, a consequence of their economic and class position. So for many migrant mothers, they were originally from poor rural areas in China and didn't have the benefit of a formal education. And this was the case for Doreen. This is Doreen here with her younger brothers. And Doreen said, "My mum spoke a pidgin English, but was illiterate because she was just a little village girl from China and she didn't have much education." So the limited language skills and restricted educational opportunities of several of the migrant mothers contrasted with that of fathers, who often had greater educational opportunity and bilingual skills. So while several women I spoke to spoke English with their siblings and to their father, they often had to learn Chinese to various extents in order to communicate with their migrant mothers. So this inadvertent learning of Chinese often resulted in a broken, or what they call pidgin, Chinese language skills. Another participant, Ina, said, "I never learned to speak Chinese brilliantly, but I did speak because my mother couldn't speak English." Patricia Yip also said, "Yes, I spoke Chinese to mum because she never spoke English. She never knew how to. She always spoke to us in Chinese, but the Chinese we spoke was very general. We didn't have deep conversations, I think because I was studying all the time." And here is Sally. Sally's in the back row on the far left with her sisters next to her and her mum and dad in front. So Sally, reflecting on her mum, said, "We were very lucky because mum couldn't speak English. She actually said in English, 'Sorry, I don't speak English.' So we were very lucky that we could speak Chinese." The importance of Sally's mum to the maintenance of her and her sister's language skills became even more evident when she spoke of her mother's death and correlated that with a loss of Chinese language. She went on to tell me, "Unfortunately, as years went by, my mother died, and being educated in Western schools and having a lot of Australian friends, I really speak Chinese, unfortunately. I do understand it. I can say a few phrases, that's about all." For Sally, like many of the other women I spoke to, her mother was the custodian of Chinese language as a direct consequence of her inability to speak English. And Sally perceives this in a positive light, claiming she was lucky because her mother had those limited English language skills, which facilitated her own learning of Chinese. So she's placing great value on the maintenance of Chinese language, while overlooking perhaps any possible disadvantages that her mum may have encountered because of this. I'm now going to move on to some formal celebrations, particularly Chinese New Year or Lunar New Year. So women's memories of childhood celebrations of New Year are common thread pointed to the central and important roles of their mothers. One woman, Margaret, recalled the efforts of her mother in keeping the tradition alive. She said, "Mum used to try and do all the customs to try and celebrate New Year, stuff like having food and things." Doreen, who I've got again up on the screen, recalled the central role of her mother. She said, "There'd be no way she'd let any of us wash our hair on Chinese New Year's Day. We'd get castigated if we broke anything, if we burnt anything. The house had to all be cleaned by New Year's Eve. All the debts had to be paid." So she stuck to those old Confucian ideas. There was a basis. It wasn't just superstition. So Margaret and Doreen, now up on the screen, made no mention, interestingly, of their fathers in reflections of New Year's celebration. So again, we're seeing this notion of mothers being the keepers of culture in childhood families, homes and families. This may be the case. Margaret's father died when she was quite young, so maybe that's why she didn't recall her father having participated in New Year. But Doreen did grow up in a nuclear family, and she still recalled that strong link between her mum and maintaining Chinese New Year traditions. Back to Nancy, she did highlight the role of both her mother and father in New Year festivities. She said, "I vividly recall Dad would make sure all his bills were paid before New Year, and Mum would have special food for us." So while both of Nancy's parents participated in the customs of the season, we can see a gendered division here between Nancy's mother's and father's role at the time. So Nancy's mother's role was, again, the realm of food and nurturing and feeding the family, while her father was in charge of the economic side. Nancy's mother also contributed to sharing and handing down more emotive homeland memories. She said it was a time that Mum really talked about her childhood, and she'd say it was how she loved Chinese New Year because she'd get a new dress and there were crackers and people would go from house to house and she'd receive a lot of licee and they flew kites. It was nice to hear her talk about that, and she'd even talk about it years later. They were very happy memories. So in this way, I believe that Nancy's mother's role as keeper of culture or cultural custodian went beyond the maintenance of just food culture. She passed down and educated her children about the traditions she experienced as a child in China, and played, as I said, an emotive role in the festivities. And this sharing of memories perhaps allowed a continued sense of connection to China and homeland, and espoused a sense of cultural identity. So, in the space of this very short presentation, I've only been able to provide a very small picture of the ways in which Chinese Australian women have contributed to the maintenance of Chinese cultural practices over the decades. I haven't been able to highlight contributions beyond the home, such as women's roles in running Chinese cafes and restaurants, the important contributions of Chinese women's associations and student associations that they were involved in, and also their contribution to Chinese culture in the creative arts and formal education spaces. So their contributions are massive. And I'd like to finish up with a return, as you can see, to the images of some of the women I interviewed. And this is because these women not only continue to pass down the culinary and language traditions to the best of their ability to their children and grandchildren, but continue to play important roles in promoting Chinese Australian culture and heritage beyond their families. So many of the women pride themselves, and it is a great source of pride to be able to cook Chinese meals and celebrate traditions such as New Year with non-Chinese friends and colleagues. And many of the women are extremely active in Chinese community groups and associations. I'm sure you see many familiar faces here. So Sally Pang, for example, has been extremely active in educating Australians of all walks of life on the contribution of her family's very famous modern China cafe, and has been actively involved in a variety of Chinese associations and foundations. Daphne Lowe Kelly is also involved in a huge amount of Chinese associations, and is an ardent advocate and leader of broader understandings and appreciation of Australia's Chinese cultural heritage. Mabel Lee contributes in a more formal capacity, as she completed her PhD in Chinese Studies at Sydney Uni in the 1960s, and continues her academic work on Chinese intellectual history and literature. Lily Lee worked as the Oriental Librarian at Sydney Uni, completed her PhD in Chinese Studies, and completed a huge biographical dictionary of Chinese women. Mary Tang, a prolific poet who produces work in English and Chinese and teaches Chinese calligraphy. And Eileen and Patricia Yip, sisters-in-law, who were featured on SBS sharing their Chinese food heritage to the whole nation. So to conclude and finish up, by uncovering these roles and responsibilities in the past and present, I hope I've highlighted the important contributions of Chinese Australian women to the cultural fabric of their families throughout their history, but also on a much broader scale to the development of multicultural Australia. I also hope I've demonstrated the way in which national discourses which have excluded Chinese Australian women need to be revised and challenge essentialist notions of white Australia by indicating the presence of cultural pluralism long before the advent of formal multiculturalism in the 1970s. And whilst I don't want to make this a sales pitch, if you are interested in reading more, here's what my book looks like. You can use the QR code to get directly to the Routledge website. There are some discount codes there as well. I do, you know, it is quite an expensive book. Academic books aren't hugely affordable. So I do encourage you to ask your local libraries, because I really think that this knowledge should be shared. The State Library and the National Library and Western Sydney Uni Library already have copies if you're interested in borrowing from there. So thanks again for having me.
Well, thank you so much, Alina. As everyone now, you can see how engaging, how interesting her research is. You know, so it's quite fascinating. And I just want to say that your research, you know, not only overturned many assumptions and stereotypes, not only from those people who do not know much about Chinese Australians, even from Chinese Australians themselves, so including myself. We do have lots of assumptions, assume, you know, Chinese women, especially in the olden days, they stayed at home, never thought of the role that they played, you know, cultural setting, as well as the national history. And I think this, you have this amazing ability discovering gems deeply buried in this daily mundane details. And also you have this exceptional ability interweaving personal stories with national history, national fabric of, you know, the makeup. It's a quite amazing and a very touching listening to you and looking at those photos. And I have to say that I constantly reminded me, oh, okay, being mum, now I know I have a bigger role, you know. So yeah, it's a really enjoyable, as I said, and I highly recommend the book. It's not just because, as I said, and I have to read, and I've read so much academic stuff. And this is the one of the exceptions, so enjoyable. So not only to your library, I would say it's a great gift, you know, gift to friends and to family. It's really nothing better than this book.
Thanks, Jean. That's very lovely of you to say. I've done a lot of public presentations on this, and I do think it does touch a lot of people's, you know, hearts, because they think, that's what my mum did, you know, and no one ever knew, and she doesn't talk about it. So I think, yeah, getting that knowledge out there is so important.
So true, so true. It's just so relatable. Yeah, let's I have some questions. So, and in the meantime, audience, so you can post your questions in the Q&A function while Alina and I have a conversation. I have a few questions. And then the first one is, you started this book, Intersectional Lives, with the story narrated by Stella, which I found extraordinarily powerful and also very touching. You know, for instance, I truly felt that I was hearing Stella's voice directly. And for a moment, I thought I was reading a memoir rather than, you know, so I would like you to tell us why you used Stella's personal account of her family story to open this book of research. And how did you choose Stella's story from the 19 participants you interviewed for this book?
Well, you hit the nail on the head there. Her story is just so engaging, and if the audience members are interested in reading, actually chapter 1 you can get for free. You can just preview PDF and you'll get chapter 1 for free, so you can read Stella's story. So Stella grew up on Thursday Island, and she had, her grandmother was sold as a concubine to a merchant on Thursday Island, and she has just this quite incredible family history in Australia. And so that was one of the main reasons I wanted to open the book with Stella's story, because it was just simply so interesting and something that I had never heard about before. And I don't think many other people would have heard such an interesting story before. And part of that is during my interview with Stella, she turned to me and she said, "But are you actually finding this very interesting?" When, wow, like what a story. So, and that's, you know, one reason, just because it is so interesting, but also because it touched on so many aspects of the book that I wanted to cover. It covered, you know, just, you know, a few pages. She talks about the courage and the contributions of the female members of her family, of mobility, of agency, of oppression, of all of the different themes that run through the book are captured in Stella's, you know, initial account. And yeah, so choosing, you know, and also, you know, pragmatically, strategically, it was a chunk of interview that I didn't need to touch very much, you know, in terms of editing. A huge part of my politics and my agenda is to allow women to speak for themselves. So it was quite easy to just grab that text from Stella and insert it at the beginning.
I do think it is a very, very successful strategic move. So yeah, it's not just a, you know, eyeball catching, but also, as you said, there are also significant reasons behind it. And for this, you know, as I mentioned, immensely interesting book, you adopted a post-colonial feminist approach. Can you tell us what that approach is and why you choose that approach?
Yeah, so I'm a geographer, I'm a historical geographer, I'm not a historian. I do have training in history, but historical geographer. And post-colonial feminism is the theoretical approach and the methodological approach that I use in my research practice. And for me, it means a variety of things. So post-colonial feminism emerged almost as a response or a challenge to traditional white Western feminism that often, focuses on white Western women and kind of espouses this universal sisterhood that all women, regardless of where they're from, have similar experiences of oppression, et cetera, as the white Western woman. So post-colonial feminism challenges that idea and urges us to think about the diversity of experiences, particularly within colonial power structures and systems. It challenges us to think about those who have been marginalized or silenced. So, you know, women of color, Indigenous women, and also really urges us to look at research, what's called research from below. So not just looking at the archives, not just looking at the history books, what has been said by authorities or journalists in newspapers, the, you know, traditional historical records, but looking the other way. Can we actually speak to the people of history through their diaries, through their letters? And in my case, I was actually able physically to speak to them. And then the last part of post-colonial feminism that I hold on to is that of intersectionality. So intersectional theory and approaches encourage us to look at the human experience, not just through the lens of gender or race or sexuality or class, but how they're intertwined and how our everyday existence and experiences are through these different identities and subject positions and structures of power, whether it's racism or patriarchy, colonialism, etc. So I'm definitely a post-colonial feminist through and through, as you can see.
Well, you know, like people often assume a methodology doesn't really matter that much, or they assume it is just naturally there or automatically there. But I think, you know, reading your book, I can tell this post-colonial feminist approach makes all the difference.
Yeah,
and that actually make your book so interesting.
Thank you, Jean. And one thing I also want to mention that approach also allows us to dig deeper into the Chinese women's experiences, because often we read about Chinese women, as I mentioned, you know, they're oppressed, they're Confucian women, they're stuck at home or stuck in China, but post-colonial feminism allows us to unravel the diversity, and to not just view these women as a homogenous group. Yeah, so I think that's very, very important.
Unravel is the key word. So that turned down all those assumptions and stereotypes. You know, Chinese in the ancient times, women are just concubines. So that's not so at all. You choose 19 participants, and as you mentioned, 6 born overseas, including mainland China, Hong Kong, New Zealand, and 13 are second or third generations. They were all born between 1920 to 1952. What was your rationale behind this selection? And also, did you know their stories before you decided to interview them?
Great question. So as a social scientist, you know, as you said earlier, methodology is key. So I didn't just, I wasn't selective in a way. What I did, there was the only criteria, and I put out a lot of advertising and approached different associations. The only criteria for participation was that women identified as Chinese Australian themselves and that they were in Australia during the White Australia period. They were the only 2 criteria. And at that time, this was a long time ago, Zoom wasn't a thing. They had to be in Sydney because that's where I was. So these were the women that wanted to participate. That was all. I didn't then select from them whose story is more interesting. No, I spoke to them all. And that leads to the second part of your question. No, I didn't know their stories beforehand. And I would never, you know, as part of my research method, I would never select, you know, some stories over others. They're all important.
Yeah, that's really fascinating. And they turn out to be like well matched, well plotted, you know, like a story is like when you do a film, you actually approach from different angles and have to come up, eventually ended up as a coherent piece. And this research is very much so, you know, so it's quite interesting. But that's very inspiring as well, you know, for other researchers, especially, you know, PhDs who are doing their studies. It's very inspiring.
I do want to say it wasn't necessarily easy to get women to talk, because for so long they haven't, you know, no one's asked them. They're very shy. I had a lot of husbands wanting to talk to me. Sorry, not interested in husbands. But now, you know, many years later, when they're seeing the book and they see my public presentation, they are so happy that they did participate. And now I'm getting other women, you know, wishing that they had contributed. So I think the momentum is there, which is really positive.
Well, that leads to my next question. I think the reason why you open their mind into I'm happy to tell the story is quite critical, because often people who read the stories afterwards, they said, that's not my story. It's the distress of seeing not your own story is enormous. So my next question is, literature often reviews that interviewer like you more likely orientates and controls the interviewing process. How did you strike the power balance and make your interview more like collaborative and non-exploitative?
Yeah, and that's a great question. And that's really part of the post-colonial feminist ethic that I follow, you know, trying to balance out, you know, obviously I benefit from this work in terms of my career and publications, etc. But what can I give back to these women and to the community? That was a driving force behind this project. And so even when I was setting up interviews, I would always ask the women, I would obviously never force them to participate, number one. Number two, give them as much control as possible. Where are you most comfortable in being interviewed? You know, if they wanted to read over the transcript and delete anything, they could. You know, many of them wanted me to come to their homes. Some of them said, no, my house is too messy, don't come. So we went to a library or something else. And, you know, a lot of women wanted, throughout the process. So I interviewed in 2010, over a decade ago. Every time I publish something, every time I do a public lecture, I let them know. So, and most of the time they come along. And so again, it's giving back to community and allowing them to play a role in the whole journey. So I think it's actually quite you know, when we get taught how to do research, you know, back in undergrad uni, you're often taught that you can't have a relationship with your research participants. You know, they're there, you talk to them and then you get out. But for me, actually, that doesn't sit right, and it's quite exploitative. So for me, it's that ongoing relationship and continually feeding back. That's really important.
I think that what you have said is really touch on two things. So one is respect. You do have like a fundamental respect to who they are, what the stories they want to tell, and that's so fundamentally important. And the other leads to that is a trust. Then eventually you gain their trust. So the trust it's a very, very valuable thing and quite fragile thing as well. So it's easy to be broken and take a long time to build up. So and take a lot to build up. Yeah. So again, that attributes back to you, you know, like your abilities, your communication skills and your intelligence, you know. So
I also have to thank my mum and dad. You know, I have a Chinese mum, Chinese Indonesian mum, and a European father, and that respect for elders has been instilled in me, or respect for humans, full stop. But I know that culturally, you know, every time I interviewed, I took something, I made biscuits and I gave it to them, and it's knowing cultural protocol and everything that goes with that. That is, when you're a researcher, it's very important.
Well, that's a very Chinese cultural protocol is compassion, what we call 人情. It's you know, like making biscuits, you know, it's just like this personal touch is quite important and quite genuine. It's a warmth that the people feel. Yeah, and so apart from interviews, which you have done fantastically, the other part is you also, I mean, I felt like so impressed that your scholarly rigor is you decided to re-examine 8 censuses that took place between 1901 to 1972, the White Australian policy period. What did you find in the census records that surprised you?
I don't know if anything surprised. I knew somehow that it was all going to be in there. But one thing is that, you know, we hear about that after 1901 with immigration restrictions, the Chinese population declined substantially. And it did. No denying that. But what I found is that the number of women increased over that period. You know, so it's doing the opposite of what the male population is doing. So that was number one, and very, very important point. So I've got some stats here. So in 1901, there were only 474 full Chinese women. And by 1947, so 40-ish years later, 2,500. Okay, so we're seeing an increase over those decades of the White Australia policy era. Such an important thing to unearth. Another important point was mobility. You know, again, this Confucian idea that women aren't allowed to travel. They have to stay at home. They have to stay in China with the in-laws. But, you know, migration data, so this isn't necessarily from the census, but from the migration data, is that no, they were moving around Australia, moving back and forth from Hong Kong or across the diaspora. So that mobility was, particularly as a geographer, was really important. Another point, this is a big one, and Jean, you were at the launch the other day and someone asked about marriage. Not all Chinese women got married, you know? So in the census records, so in 1901, there were 503 unmarried women of marriageable age, 503 of them. By 1961, 2,500 unmarried Chinese women of marriageable age. So notions of, oh, there weren't enough women here for Chinese men to marry, or Chinese women, the only role they have is to be a wife or mother. Some women were not getting married for whatever reason. So that was a really important point. And my last one is this enduring presence of Chinese women in Australia. So the census records show, even though I looked from 1901, they have data to show how long they had been in Australia. So some women had been in Australia from before, you know, the 1900s. As you know, most of us know that, you know, they were here. It's just that they're not being talked about. So I thought that was a really, really important part and interesting part of the census records.
Yeah, it is amazing. You know, like all these notions has been overturned by what you have discovered in the records. And also they are strong evidence to support your arguments. It's quite a watertight proof, you know, so your approach is quite powerful. And you touch on this full Chinese, which I found quite interesting because obviously that's happening in the society, but I don't see that are being mentioned often, you know, in print. So I'm quite interested in your discussion. You have section talk about full Chinese and mixed Chinese. And I noticed that there was no mixed Chinese in your 19 participants you interviewed. I suppose that the home environments of a mixed and a full Chinese aren't entirely the same. Have you researched on, or do you know if a mixed Chinese females could play the same role as cultural custodians as a full Chinese female?
This is a very interesting question. So I do want to flag that I find the terminology mixed and full very problematic and uncomfortable. So I use those terms because that was how the census and the government defined people in this era. So mixed or half caste, and it was a very racialized colonial concept of humans, and it followed like a blood rule that if you had a, you know, the one drop rule was in America, and we had a very similar thing. If you had bloodline outside of a European race, you know, you were a half caste. If two parents, and they had all these definitions within the census records. So usually this data was used to exclude people from the European race. You know, so if you had a Chinese father and a European mother, automatically you did not belong to the European race. Automatically you were a Chinese half caste. So I kind of flip it on its head, and I use the terms to include people. So including these women as part of the Chinese community, because that's how the government would have defined them. So, and, you know, obviously myself being of mixed heritage as well, it was quite a important point for me to make. So in terms of, you know, where were their experiences, if you were mixed, is it the same experiences? I do want to flag that even if both parents are Chinese, doesn't mean your experience is the same. They were all different, and it depended on things like, are your parents migrants? Do they, personality, do they want to hold on to Chinese culture or do they not? Do they want their children, boys, girls, to go to school and get jobs, or do they want the girls to stay home and help mum? So yes, of course, everyone's experience is going to be different. And I can't put it down to whether it's because they're mixed or they're not. And the participants, none of them actually said that they were mixed, maybe because I didn't ask them outright, for just those reasons that I don't like the terminology. But, you know, one participant, Meilin Yam, just at the top of my head, her grandmother had a Chinese mother and an Anglo-Australian father. So I'm sure throughout their family histories, there were some mixing. It just wasn't very important to the interview participants. So I hope that answers the question.
Oh, answered enormously. I think it's really good because, I mean, it's a complex question, but you really touch on the complexities. And that not only applies to Chinese, you know, full Chinese or mixed Chinese, if we say that, it touches on Indigenous people and Australian population in general, you know. Absolutely.
Yeah, so I was going to say, you asked, have I done any research? So I'm currently in the process of doing a project, contemporary era, on young mixed race Australians from all different backgrounds. So I'm really pushing my interest in that now. So I'll have some more information soon.
Yeah, I think that would be really fascinating, and it is a very interesting, you know, complex but also interesting topics. So yeah, looking forward to. And you also really touch on my next question about everyone is not the same. So your research basically challenged the view and the perception of a Chinese cultural uniformity and the centrality of a Confucius ideals among Chinese families. You know, everyone would be the same following Confucius ideals. Can you elaborate on your findings, especially on girls' education and women's work or not employment?
Yeah, so wow, this was something that I was so glad that I came across. And so let's start with education. So this was mixed. Obviously in Australia, girls have to go to, all children have to go to school to a particular age. In some families, it was strongly encouraged that the girls go as high as they can to university. As I mentioned, Lily Lee, although Lily Lee came as an adult, but Maybelle Lee went all the way, did her PhD. So many other of the women went through tertiary education, became, you know, scientists and lawyers and whatever. Other participants went to school to a certain age, and then the parents wanted them to work in the family business or help mum at home, looking after the younger siblings. So again, it was such a diversity of experiences. Some of them, so that was the family influence. For others, it was at school. Some teachers would say, you know, you're a girl, you don't need to study maths, you can't study science, or you're just going to go to teachers' college or secretarial college. In fact, some teachers said you can't be a teacher because you're Chinese, the kids aren't going to respect you. So again, it was coming from multiple directions. In terms of economic and employment opportunities, as I said, some of them went on to be hugely successful. Helen Sham-Ho was one of, you know, the first Chinese-born parliamentarian in Australia, is one of the women I interviewed. But more commonly, it was women working in family businesses. So whether they were the restaurants or the jewelry business or the furniture factory, things like that. So yeah, women were very economically active. Running, as I show that beautiful photo of Eileen's mum in front of her noodle shop in Cairns, she ran that business on her own without being able to read or write English. It's like phenomenal.
Yes. Wow, I have so many questions. I have to.
It's 5 o'clock.
I know it's, yeah, exactly. I'll ask my last question, which is, you know, I found fascinating, and I really want to you elaborate on that. In presenting this racial discrimination, obviously that happened because there was a wide Australian policy period, especially the racial discrimination manifested in schoolyard bullying, name calling, Ching-Chong Chinaman, you know, like in those olden days, but still it persisted till today. People don't say that, but people say, go back to where you came from. So same thing, and border entry restrictions because you were Chinese, so you were not allowed in. And you had a discussion on culture and national identity, you know, Chineseness and Australianness of the participants. Can you share a story or two from the participants that touched you deeply on this topic?
Yeah, so there were many stories of the schoolyard bullying and that type of thing. Often the women I spoke to said that it wasn't so much purposeful racism. It was often people being interested in Chineseness and asking strange questions. So, you know, being at work and your colleague would say, oh, can you tell me how to cook fried rice? So it's like these assumptions that are made about your cultural identity. And it's like, I've got no idea how to cook fried rice. Why are you asking me this? Or they're asking because I'm a Chinese woman. Then, you know, yeah, you mentioned border restrictions. So Daphne Lowe Kelly, for example, New Zealand born Chinese, when she came to Australia, you know, should be a really easy jump over the water because she's a Kiwi, but in fact, because she has Chinese heritage, the immigration department made that very, very difficult. So yeah, lots of more everyday type racism and discrimination and assumptions. I do have to say that most of the women told me that it's worse now than what it was back in the White Australia policy era. Back then, they said because they were a bit exotic, you know, people were more interested. And a lot of the time, these families were so central to the community. We think about all the department stores and the restaurants in rural New South Wales and Queensland that was so important to the community. Whereas these days, it's, I'm part of the Challenging Racism Project. It's such an issue. So that was an interesting observation that they've had.
Well, thank you so much. And I think I will give the audience a few minutes to take some questions. A few more comments than the questions. So the first one from Lynn. Lynn said, I found it very interesting that you mentioned Stella, as she is my mother's first cousin. And I'm in contact with her as my source for family history. The story of her childhood on Thurston Island brought up by her grandmother is fascinating. That's Lynn's comment. Another comment from Sunim. Your description of a post-colonial feminism is really helpful. I'm a white Anglo woman, but I've lived many years in Asian countries, and it's challenging when people question the different cultural contexts I'm willing to participate in, which my white Anglo-European sisters often view, one-dimensionally as oppressive for women. The not so subtle definition arising from Western feminist thought often don't appreciate the shades and nuances of differently contexted women's power and authority in different cultural contexts.
Oh, that's
well said. Yeah, exactly. Sunim is really well described, and thanks for discussing it. Dao Zhi has a question. Thanks, Alina, for a wonderful presentation. Your research is fantastic in challenging many assumptions about Chinese Australian women. Could you please say a bit more about the factors that have contributed to the increase of Chinese women in Australia during 1901 to 1940s?
Yeah, great question. So if I'm looking at the census data, could be simply put down, well, not simply, but primarily put down to births, because most of these women were born in Australia. So not so much migrant women coming in, but yeah, women being born. What was interesting, so it's the full Chinese women increasing by our births in Australia, which means logically that there were women here before then giving birth to these women. So again, points to that longer legacy of presence in Australia.
So interesting, and I think it just opened up so many aspects of saying probably the things we have seen or heard, just now it's all opened up. It's fascinating. And Asha has a comment, Asha from Western Sydney University. She said, fascinating work, Alina. I have learned so much, so thank you. My takeaway was the focus on language. The Chinese media was the largest ethnic media in Australia. She's from journalist. Xingdao publisher was a Chinese businesswoman, Sally Oh. So that's her comment.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, but obviously that's in the olden days. I still remember when I first came in 1980s, so that a few Chinese, everyone read them. It's actually these days is more social media. So my last question, since I don't have any questions, I don't think from the audience, is what's your next project? I mean, now you can't do so many. I just feel like, yeah.
So I've recently completed a project on Asian Australians' experiences of racism during the pandemic. So that report has already been published, and that was funded primarily by the Victorian government. So that is more my contemporary work that I do. As I mentioned, I'm also doing a project on mixed race young Australians, their sense of identity and belonging and racism, that type of thing. What else am I doing? I do quite a bit of work for SBS. Doing big projects for them. In terms of this Chinese Australian women, well, this has been with me for, as I said, for over a decade. And with the publication of this book, I don't see things slowing down. I had someone email me the other day, and I think from Macquarie University, and they're interested on the Indigenous Chinese connection. That's something that I'm also really, really interested in. So you never know, that might be in the works. But this is just the tip of the iceberg, you know, in terms of Chinese Australian women in our history. There is so much more. And doing some comparisons, you know, perhaps between what was happening with Chinese women here versus in the States, in Canada, the US, what was happening across the diaspora. Also perhaps doing some comparisons or connections between women, Chinese Australian women here and Italian women and Greek women and Jewish women, because they were also coming, you know, post-1950s, World War II. You know, what are some connections between those groups of women? So much research still to do.
I know, just, you know, it is so true, just the iceberg, the tip of the iceberg that, you know, you touch on those 19 women, because, you know, as I specifically mentioned, they came at a specific period, but then afterwards there were so many other types of you know, Chinese came, and I think selfishly next project should be on my generation. You know, we came over 30 years ago.
Yes,
and,
well,
you know,
Jan Ryan,
20s, you know,
yeah, well,
as a students.
the wonderful Jan Ryan has written a book on global women in the global village, I think, I've forgotten, which is that post-1970s, 1980s migration to Australia. Yeah, let's see.
Yeah, exactly. So thank you so much, Alana, for this fascinating talk. And we can't wait to have you come back to talk to about your next project.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you so much. And audience, I would also like to thank you and for your participation, for your interest. And as I mentioned, get this book. It is really fascinating and you won't regret. It's a great gift for your friends and families, and also for your own record. And you may want to pass on to your children, actually. So it's a very good book. And thank you again. And we look forward to seeing you again in our next lecture 3. So we will have a Dr. Dao Zhi who will give us a talk in the lecture 3. Thank you all, and have a good evening. Bye, Lana. Bye, everyone.